and I think that one of the things that's interesting is this your out of town? If your will it play in Peoria tryout for Zann? This is the beginning of a series of talks and discussions she's going to be leading, I think, in the next year or two.
Yeah.
So this is
it's the very first.
Very first. So we're the guinea pigs, or she's the guinea pig for us. And I think that the first question was artificial life, the value of an artificial life prize.
Whatever you feel like, this is just a free-for-all, okay? Whatever strikes you.
Of course, if you look at what the X Prize is doing for space and the DARPA Grand Challenge for robotics, I don't know if you remember the first DARPA Grand Challenge, when the great big vehicle, whatever it was, ran off the road at 11 kilometers and sort of collided with sagebrush and whatever, and then Red Whittaker famously pronounced that it was an incredible success because it had proved how little autonomous robotics had done actually in 40 years. And as you were walking down these hallways here, these are famous hallways because a robot aptly named Shaky navigated these hallways back 35, 40 years ago, I think. That's the history here at SRI. So you're in the building where autonomously navigating vehicles kind of got their start. There was happening in Britain and over here. But the DARPA Grand Challenge really put everything to the test. So the idea of an artificial life or an alive prize, or the idea was in 2000, 2001 of having such an annual prize where you would put your systems forth and some kind of a measure, a laboratory, I guess is the concept, some kind of a testing lab or a consumer reports crash test group puts the environment to the test, and somehow, or there's biologists, philosophers, mathematicians, and spiritual thinkers observing it, maybe to observe it for properties that just seem to make sense to them. This is one of the discussions I had with Dawkins in 2001 over tea, was would this be of value, and he thought it was of tremendous value. But anyway, so that's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, if you had a venue every year that you could go to, kind of like an X Prize competition, like I always wear my Spaceship One hat. This is, I wear it around the farm, so it's totally worn out. I recently saw Mike Melville, the original pilot, and he says, "What happened to your Spaceship One hat?" Because this is the hat that you could buy down at Mojave Spaceport on the first day that Mike took his vehicle to 62 miles and back, and almost didn't come back. That's sort of an interesting story behind that. But Spaceship One is kind of a metaphor for when you do offer a prize. And there have been a number of, I guess, abortive attempts to offer prizes for the artificial life field. But it's what Dawkins came up with, which was interesting to me, is what he said: don't come up with absolutes. You might come up with a series of properties that measure lifelikeness. This is actually Danny Hillis's idea was lifelikeness. So you could have like a scale, or like you think of Olympic figure skating where they hold up 7.2 or 8.4, right? Some kind of a sliding scale where you decide Dawkins' idea was over several years of this competition where maybe no prize is awarded, you come up with new definitions over time. And then you have different lifelikeness scales on different properties. And the properties will shift constantly. And it was fascinating enough to him. It's like, why is this fascinating to you? And he said, it gets at the creationists, for one thing, because back in 2001 he was on that track by that point. And it also will force biology into some fundamental sort of navel-gazing, soul-searching for what defines a living system, a basic definition. So we already have a discussant jumping in here.
I think first of all, in a collegial spirit, I'd like to say I couldn't disagree more with your comments. I think that there's nothing abstract about the A prize at all if you're talking about artificial life. Now, if you're talking about artificial intelligence, it might be incredibly abstract. And one of the things I've noticed listening closely tonight is that there doesn't seem to be an understanding that there is a difference between AI and AL. And that's a whole conversation that I would enjoy having with the people in this room. In terms of artificial life, I propose to it absolutely define the moment when artificial life is created. It's called the carbon barrier. It's explained on my website. And I'd just like to say that there already is an A prize. Its current value, I'm sad to say, is $26,742. And if you were going to compare it to the X prize, which I'm glad you did, in terms of what it means to humanity to do what the X prize required versus what the A prize requires, it should be funded at least 2 orders of magnitude higher, in my opinion. And so there is an A prize. Its parameters are well defined, but they're working parameters. And so I would really enjoy anyone who would like to get in the dialogue on the A prize as it exists in Allan Goldstein world. And of course, everybody's got their own world.
Allan, could you introduce yourself to the group? Your background a little bit, or I'm curious.
Well, my background is really that I'm a chemist, and that makes me different from almost everyone else who works on artificial life, which is why I think I come at artificial life differently than most people who come at it from artificial intelligence or, sort of the silicon, sort of the gray side of it. I don't know what color I come at it, but I think more in terms of chemistry. And so, for example, I can show you an artificial life form that has 46 atoms in it. Okay, end of story. Bertrand Russell called this chemical imperialism. We're all the products of carbon chemical imperialism. And chemical intelligence operates at a much more fundamental level than computer intelligence, shall we say. So my background is I'm a physical chemist, a molecular geneticist, and a biomaterials person, which means I spend a lot of time looking at the interface between living and non-living materials. And so, for example, my take on biological life is it's just a chemical instruction set. It could have been a different one, but this is the one that we got by a stochastic process. So anyway, the bottom line, I just wanted to make people aware that there is in fact an A prize. And we can modify it. It needs to be of much greater value to stimulate people to participate in it appropriately. But when you think about what's at stake, to break the carbon barrier, to bring other forms of chemistry into the game, that's the end of biological evolution when that happens. What's that prize worth? I mean, if the X prize is worth $10 million, that prize should be worth $100 million. So when
What is the carbon barrier? People have been talking about that a lot. I'm not familiar with that.
yeah, you can find, there's always Allan, ALAN, H Goldstein, GOLDSTEIN.com. But basically, the carbon barrier works like this. If all the instructions that you need, see, I'm talking about artificial life versus artificial intelligence. If all the instructions you need to get through your life cycle or propagate your life cycle, because you could be alive indefinitely, you don't have to actually reproduce, right? But if the entire instruction set can be contained in DNA and or RNA, then you're a biological life form. If any essential part of that instruction set can't be coded by DNA and RNA, then you are not a biological life form, as we define it.
What if there's space aliens that don't necessarily have DNA?
Well, then you win the A prize. Show me. The bottom line is, I mean, it's really simple. That's my point. Chemical intelligence operates at a much more profound level than a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight, which is not to denigrate any of the things we've been talking about tonight. Zann's talk was great. The other talk was great. But artificial life. And the perfect example of this, by the way, is if you look at the Synthetic Biology 2.0 logo. It's got an E. coli full of nanowires and laser beams. So people don't even know most of the time whether they're talking about synthetic biology, artificial life, or artificial intelligence. There's total confusion out there. And a group like this has a tremendous opportunity to bring some clarity of vision to that. And I hope that people do.
So you say the life is not in the DNA, RNA, obviously. It's not even at molecular level. It's even further deep down. It becomes immaterial, and that's why we have this notion of...
Well, I've used the term material sapiens as like the next step in evolution as it's going to occur on this planet. Now, if someone wants to bring in a space alien, that would be great, because my beautiful wife, Kate, wants to believe, and so that could happen. But the bottom line is, if you, I mean, that's why it's not abstract. If any single essential step in your propagation sequence or your prolongation sequence can't be coded for by DNA or RNA, you have crossed the carbon barrier. You're no longer a biological life form.
By DNA and RNA, you mean not the content, but the method,
I mean the
But
chemical
it can be
instructions.
also virtual DNA and RNA. It can be virtual DNA and RNA. But you are referring only to the...
You see, the decision-making process has nothing to do with the DNA, RNA. That's where the left and right brain enter in play.
No, the decision-making process about what? I'm talking about a life form. What kind of life form is it? Is it biological or is it not biological?
The moment evolves makes a decision.
So I'm saying there's no abstraction there.
What's the name for the single-celled organism that doesn't have DNA?
There's no single-celled organism that I'm aware of that doesn't have DNA and RNA. And for example, the prion, even though once it starts to propagate, no longer needs DNA and RNA. You originally did need DNA or RNA to code for the first protein that mutates. So even prions fall in that, much as I hate to use the word, paradigm. Okay. So that's the bottom line. Is it a biological life form? Is it not a biological life form? That's the bottom line for the A prize as it exists right now.
Could
Or
I
the one
suggest
that
that we've got several more people, and then we can come back and
Yeah, that's
have a
fine.
general free-for-all? So why don't we move on and hear what Steve Monroe has to say, and then we're going to hear Bonnie Devarco, and John, are you going to speak about CSAP? Sure. Yeah, okay.
So Zann asked me to talk about the E prize. I work in artificial intelligence, and so my primary focus is on cognition, but I'm very interested in evolutionary processes that give rise to rational cognition. And you can think of evolution as a form of cognition. In some ways, sort of stochastic search is a simple way of solving problems. And there's a big gap between what we see actually happening in biology and the kinds of things that we see simulated on computers. And so there's a big burgeoning community of genetic programs and genetic algorithms. They tend to go very, very slowly. In fact, we sort of sometimes joke it's the genetic algorithm is often the third best way of doing something, but there's usually some problem-specific algorithm that's very efficient. Some kind of neural net-based thing is often pretty good, and then a genetic thing is often much, much slower. On the other hand, it's usually much easier to specify and much easier to run from a practical point of view. But if you look at what goes on in biology, I mean, you see unbelievably complicated behaviors. I mean, one of my favorites is the tarantula wasp. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a little wasp that flies around and lives its life. And when it's time for the female to lay its eggs, she flies around, and from the air, she knows what a certain kind of tarantula's nest looks like. She can go in there, she does a little dance, it's exactly the right thing to get the tarantula to come out. She knows exactly where to sting the tarantula, and her venom is exactly right to paralyze but not kill the tarantula. She then lays her eggs in the tarantula and then buries it back in its nest. When the eggs are born, they feed off of the paralyzed tarantula, and then the whole cycle repeats. And it's amazing and very typical of biological systems. When you look at that, the standard sort of stepwise evolutionary processes, if any one of those steps isn't there, the whole thing is useless. And so understanding how some behavior, complex behavior system like that can occur, I think is a very, very interesting thing. And I think it suggests, another thing that's a lot of recent evidence that's coming out is that biological evolution is happening much faster than anybody thought it was. People have looked at the birds on the Galapagos Island, and over a period of 20 years, they evolved very, very significantly. Just this morning, there's some new results about the proteins in sperm. There's sperm competition in a lot of species. That different males sort of have sperm whose goal it is not just to impregnate the egg, but to kill the sperm of other males. And it turns out that the proteins in the sperm are evolving really, really fast. And so it's very, very interesting. So one of the great things about artificial life is I think it gives us an opportunity to explore different mechanisms for evolution and see what's important. There are several. Zann mentioned the Baldwin effect, which was proposed by Baldwin over 100 years ago, but not really taken very seriously by biologists, I think. And what it is it's standard or ordinary Darwinian evolution, except with creatures that can learn. And the fact that the creatures can learn changes the evolutionary fitness landscape. So imagine that there's some peak in the landscape that you get to after, say, 10 stages of learning. If a random mutation pushes you a bit along the path that you would have learned, well, then you're going to move along that path more quickly. And so we now, might have this peak in the landscape here. The fact that we have learning gives a sort of gradual slope, and it causes the genome to move along the path that would have been learned until eventually you end up being born knowing the things that you would have had to learn before. From the outside, it looks miraculous. It looks very Lamarckian that something that a creature learned originally ends up eventually ending up in the genome. So it's an amazing, very powerful mechanism. And most biologists didn't even look at it. The artificial life community started studying it about 10 years ago. Hinton and Nolan have a nice paper on it. And it turned out to be very, very important in the simulated environment that they created. So I think it's a great example of something like that. I have a variant of that I call a deliberative Baldwin effect, which is when you consider creatures which don't just learn but deliberate. They reason about their environment. They think about the future consequences of their actions, and they make choices according to those future consequences. Turns out that also changes the fitness landscape and can actually give evolution the ability to look ahead, something that is often said, evolution can't look ahead. Whereas if you have creatures, say for instance, let's say the environment is getting colder, and creatures can look at their potential mates and see whether they have more or less hair. They can select mates that are going to be more fit for the environment that's there, and so they can look ahead, and that look ahead actually gets into the evolutionary process. Another example is the whole controversy over group selection. In the 60s, Wynne Edwards had a notion of group selection that individuals might limit their reproduction for the good of their group. And then that was rightfully trashed in the 70s as, no, it can't work unless it's good for the individual gene, and then the selfish gene and all that came out. And group selection was just thrown away. It was a bad word. If you said group selection, people looked at you in horror. And now in the last decade or so, it's coming out that no, there are very important group selective mechanisms. They don't work in the simplistic way that Wynne Edwards did, but a lot of the balance between cooperation and competition, a group is much more effective if it can have cooperative members. And it's not just good for the group, it's good for the members. And so understanding how cooperation can evolve in what might at first look like a purely competitive situation, very, very important, and not very well understood in the biological context. Artificial life is a beautiful setting in which we can really understand these mechanisms. And so I think it's going to shed light on evolutionary processes that we can just barely begin to understand. Some of the things Zann talked about and I think are in your book could be extremely important, could really shake up our understanding of how evolution works. So,
That's
comments?
a great opportunity for the A-Life community. Huge, absolutely.
Very important.
Comments?
it suggests that not only the phenotype pass from generation to generation, but also knowledge or maybe behavior, of course, but knowledge too.
Yeah, knowledge. Having creatures like humans, where we actually have a repository of knowledge and we learn from it, that dramatically changes. You know, if you just look at the
So knowledge passes through the DNA, or
oh, in the Baldwin effect, or
no? In your approach, how do you explain passing or having learning from generation, passing from generation to generation? You must use some kind of transfer of knowledge from two generations.
well, I mean, there are several ways. I mean, the sort of standard model is that no knowledge passes through the DNA, but that we have a learning phase where a parent can, say, teach an offspring some behaviors or something like that.
You're talking about knowledge, passing knowledge explicitly.
I mean, there are certainly models like that. I don't know how many of them are biologically plausible. Are you talking about the deliberative Baldwin effect? No, see, that is just straight standard Darwinian evolution, except that with creatures which themselves look ahead at the consequences of their actions. And so they deliberate about their actions. In particular, they deliberate about what other creatures they want to collaborate with, they want to mate with, and they want to fight with. Those choices affect the genomes of the next generation in a way that, even if it's just straight Darwinian evolution going on underneath, the fact that the creatures themselves are deliberating, thinking about the future, and choosing their actions based on their cognitive understanding of the situation means that the genomes reflect those choices in the future. In particular, mate selection, you can see that really directly. That you know, there are certain traits that are viewed as sexy. In the case of, there's a wonderful book called The Mating Mind, which looks at many of the amazing aspects of humanity, our ability to speak, our artistic ability, our musical ability, and views those as sexual signals. And they were viewed as, you know, they're sexy characteristics. Somebody who can keep a good rhythm, becomes a sexy trait. That gets selected for, and then that kind of ends up, you know, dramatically altering the nature of our brains and our
So social behavior is coded.
Yes, and the key is that it can start at the mental level, and a few generations later, it's now down in the genome. And so things that sort of began as an idea end up encoded in the genes, just through straight Darwinian mechanisms, but with the pressure of a deliberative creatures in there.
Could there be a feedback loop? Excuse me? Could there be a feedback loop?
Oh, definitely. Understanding that, I think. I mean, just looking at what happens in sexual selection, huge runaways in different directions. Peacock's tail is an extreme example of that. And many say that the huge growth of the human brain is exactly that. Yeah.
Where do you see the dividing line between artificial life and artificial intelligence?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think artificial life is very focused on you know, creating almost an artificial physics within the creature, within which the creatures operate. And artificial intelligence in general isn't constrained by that. And you can do intelligence however you can do it. And also the aspect of reproduction and looking at how change happens. You know, I see artificial life as being much more focused on that than what typical AI is. AI typically uses learning algorithms and doesn't really, you know, there's certainly approaches to AI based on evolutionary ideas, but that isn't really central to the AI plan.
Give us a little bit of your background and introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. I actually have a PhD in physics, but I immediately, right after finishing, went to actually work with Danny Hillis at his then new company, Thinking Machines.
Right.
And switched to doing artificial intelligence. I developed the first programming language for the connection machine, did a lot of machine vision tasks on that. Taught at the University of Illinois, we built robot systems that read lips and control robot arms with cameras. And been in a bunch of different research labs. Right now I run a combination think tank technology development company called Self-Aware Systems, where we're interested in systems that learn by watching their own behavior and improving themselves. And this has potentially very important technological consequences. It also has huge social consequences. And how do we encode our human values and human morality now to make sure that whatever this very rapidly changing technology gives rise to actually reflects our human values? And I think the ALI simulations can be very important in that as well. Great.
I want to throw in one thing on this, the distinction between artificial life and artificial intelligence, just to come down on the side of fuzzing up those boundaries. Personally, I think there's a huge possibility for cross-disciplinary interchange if we don't say, well, we've got to, have a clear separation. This is artificial life, this is artificial intelligence, and we want to keep these things separate. I think we want to bring them together.
So we've been walking around a lot of micro scale thinking, and Zann asked me to say a few things about the world game concept of Buckminster Fuller, the Buckminster Fuller Challenge Prize that Buckminster Fuller Institute started last year, and we're getting ready the second year for having people put in their 1,500-word proposals for a broad range of design solutions that reflect Buckminster Fuller's understanding that his work and his lifetime experiment reflected, which was that we really can address humans' most pressing problems and the problems that we've actually created that spill out into our ecosystem. We're not in control of our ecosystem, but we're certainly affecting it, and we're affected by it. But he saw a design science revolution. So if we think about, I think the thing that was really important, the most important thing with regard to this Q Prize idea that you're speaking about is that A-Life is the ultimate synthetic perspective. And I think that's really key. That's very close to the way that so many of us approach an understanding of Fuller's concept of comprehensive anticipatory design science is applied micro-incisively and macro-inclusively, which were his terms that he put out there. So to really broaden the scope of the powerful tools of thinking, tools of the way that you're thinking about creating life and all of the things that come into it, the social dimension, the value system, the ethical part, the ethics of it, fitness, all of these different ways we have to stretch our mind and wrap it around the problems of what is life is a kind of a perspective that we need in addressing the practical problems of today. So I just want to mention a few things. I didn't prepare anything specifically for this, but in your talk, the thing that is so powerful about what Buckminster Fuller did, those of you are probably familiar with the geodesic dome if you're not familiar with Buckminster Fuller, right? Geodesic dome? Well, most of us don't really understand the geodesic dome is a special case example of a generalized principle, universal principles. And what he really did was apply design in a scale-independent way. And this is what the A-Life process that I can see really does, is that we're really talking about a design process. And I think that's something that you really bring to fore in your books and the way that you speak, Zann, about life, that we're really talking about design and what design principles are scale independent. What can you apply to the biosphere that you can also apply to the cell? You have to think macro inclusively as we're working on every scale. So getting beyond scale is part of our issue that we're facing today, humanity is facing, is we're able to, simple example, Google Earth, fly downs, we can change scale on the fly, very easy, very smooth. We can look at the world from different points of view that no humans had the opportunity to look at our world this way in speed up time, slow down time. And this was what world game was all about, and the geoscope concept that Fuller put out basically first got the idea almost in the late 1920s. So I'm always trying to think of, okay, how is this so similar to A Life, is that you run the gamut of all of the considerations. You must deal with scale issues as well as human, social, interaction, collaboration. The issues that we're dealing with have to propel us into a different framework of thinking. And I think the framework that A Life has to adopt to deal with the biggest, most essential problems of what is life and what is evolution and how do things grow and evolve is, it would be helpful to inform some of these larger scale issues that we don't have these kinds of discussions. So, and very few people, because we think of artificial intelligence as a very, not ivory tower, but a very small segment of our intelligent population is even thinking about these problems, we tend to think of it, oh, well, you know, we can't wrap our hands around those ideas. And so bridging them to global problems, global realities, simulating the global environment in the physical world that we live in is an application area for A Life. So that's
I just remembered something as you were thinking that I had totally forgotten, but I think Buckminster Fuller actually looked back and he realized that he had written, and you're going to be able to correct me on it, exactly the same time that Erich Neumann was writing his cybernetics in 1949. And Fuller thought that he had sort of simultaneously, he wasn't aware of Norbert Winger's work, but he felt that he had simultaneously come up with some parallel ideas.
Well, his ideas paralleled and came before Vannevar Bush's, as we may think. He, at the same year that Moore's Law came out, actually 2 years before that, the futurist John McHale and Buckminster Fuller had worked on the same kind of acceleration idea, not applied to technology, but the acceleration of communication and transportation patterns that in turn influence a thing he called accelerating acceleration. That was historically right at the same time as Moore's Law was becoming instated in the world for the first time. So there's a lot of parallels of Bucky's thought, and we're now finding out many more of these things because his archive is now fully available at Stanford for researchers, and it wasn't available to this extent until now, really until this year. So I think you can track some of these really great ideas, and you could create a timeline where you could connect him to some of these great breakthrough thinkers.
Does anybody want to put forward any ideas related to this world game?
Here's a parallel for you. For the next 2 years, I'm at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And in reading the history of the Institute, there's a great book called Darwin Among the Machines, written by George Dyson, who was brought up in the leafy streets around where his father's house is, Freeman's house is, near the Institute. And it turns out where the current preschool is, next to the housing that I stay in when I'm there, there's this nice little brick building, it's a preschool building, and in it was the von Neumann machine, built between about 1947 and 1950. And you have to understand the Institute for Advanced Study, which was pretty new at the time, it was an Institute for Advanced Study. They did not do laboratory things. They did not build things. So the trustees kind of like, if it's far enough away from Fold Hall, we'll ignore what might be happening over there. And what was happening over there was John von Neumann and his team were coming up with the modern computer architecture that is everywhere now. And what he did was, people don't realize this, they were so far ahead in thinking than the rest of the world. Well, one of the benefits of that being far ahead was they would publish these quarterly reports and send them out. And basically it said, steal these ideas. And everyone from Chicago to Harvard to whatever would get these reports and say, why are we coming up with the computer architecture? This is so much better, let's just use it. So it was the open sourcing of the von Neumann architecture with caches and registers and second level this and buses, and it's all there, and he just gave it away. The Institute didn't care, it didn't have any propriety about that architecture, but one of the first large-scale programs written for the IAS machine, it had no name, it was called the IAS machine. If it had a name, it might have gotten in trouble, right, with the administration, so it was like the thing over in the brick building. And it was a program written by an N. Boricelli, called Numerical Symbioorganisms. And it was the first large-scale program, really, of any kind of scientific or statistical nature for the IS machine, and it came live in 1950 when the machine came online. It was an impressive machine. It was pretty fast. We had used all kinds of tube storage and whatever. It was a no slouch. And so this symbioorganism program filled up the capacity of the von Neumann machine. And it actually helped them to test the von Neumann machine in a similar way that Tom Barbalet's Noble Ape is used to test the multi-core processors at Intel right now. And the weird thing about it is, maybe a kind of a biologically inspired, very pre-proto-artificial life program was helping to just flex the muscles of this new medium. It wasn't that it was a what did somebody call it, a synthetic, synergistic, to use a Bucky term. It was a synergistic thing because it was really the first program that pushed the limits on the von Neumann architecture. Was an artificial life type of program. And it was lost to history until I read it in Dyson's book on his childhood. Because I used to kick around in this building and pick up old parts from this extinct machine when he was a kid in the 50s.
Dyson gave a talk at Google, and I believe the video of his talk is publicly available.
George Dyson.
George Dyson,
The
yeah.
historian.
Yeah, George.
Yes.
The son.
Yeah.
And builder of fantastic canoes.
Yeah,
It's off somewhere.
he showed us the diagram of the first hard drive, which was essentially an electrical motor, a belt, bicycle wheel, and a piece of iron like on the edge of the bicycle wheel. So much for hard drives.
Let's just make a comment on scalability, chemical intelligence, because look what carbon has done to this planet on every scale. So it's almost, for all practical purposes, infinitely scalable, or at least within our frame of reference.
John?
Yeah.
So I'm a grad student at Brown, currently working at NASA Ames. And I guess in terms of an S prize for a space prize, or an S prize for a synthesis prize, because talking about synthetic biology and constructing whole genomes, I'm much more in favor that if we're going to be utilizing biology, then we may as well go with what we've got rather than starting from scratch with an artificial cell. That's just my point of view and the point of view of where synthetic biology comes from. But in terms of an S prize, I think you've got to do two things. One is to either grab the public's attention so that they're going to fund such a prize, or grab industry attention so that it becomes economically important to fund such a prize. In terms of space, I think the next step for humanity is to settle the solar system, and NASA's keen on working on ISRU, in situ resource utilization. Biology is ISRU. It's what life is. It fixes carbon dioxide as primary producers, and then other things can feed off of those fixed carbon products to produce everything that we see around us, including ourselves. A simple mission would be to send a bioreactor to wherever you want to go in the solar system and try and use the resources available and, for example, on Mars, land, drill down, have a power source that could melt water, inoculate the culture, and have the cells reproduce. Now, simple reproduction, let's say yeast or E. coli, could produce plenty of biomass, biomass being fixed carbon product. That's the very simplest thing that they could do, glucose, oxygen. But if you think about what else we know that biology is very good at, we know it can produce biofuels, we know it can produce biomaterials. So if you think on the simplest level of what you could produce is biomass, which is for food and life support, on the more complex level you could produce biofuel or biomaterial. What takes us from the most simple level to the most complex level is what's encoded in the genome of the organism that you put inside the bioreactor on your chosen solar body. And what's written on that genome is soon to be decided by the biological engineer. At the moment it is decided by a biological engineer, but only a very rich biological engineer. It will cost between $500,000 and $20 million to write an entire genome. The cost of that is falling, halving every 2 years. So soon it's going to cost just a few $1,000s to write an entire genome, but maybe 10 years or so. So an S prize, I think, would be either a synthesis prize or an S prize for space that looks at getting the production and the cost of DNA synthesis down to the level where you can write genomes for a few $100s. And then, if we understand enough about genome organization and complexity, that we can design rationally the organism to utilize whatever resources we land on, then the rest is history. We can easily make biofuel. Take that back. We can make biofuel with biomaterials. It's not going to be easy, but we can definitely do it because you look around at what nature's done. So that's where I put my money is in an S prize, synthesis/space, as I think as soon as we have cheap whole genome synthesis, we're going to be in a much stronger position to design organisms for wherever we want to go.
I'd just make a quick comment on that. I would propose that long before we colonize the solar system, we will have speciated. So whoever or whatever colonizes the solar system, it won't be a biological organism anymore. And the synthetic biology that you described is one of five life form types that I've currently proposed. And once again, it's a proposal. I would really welcome feedback from the group on that. So, and third point would be there already is a prize for the cheap genome. I don't know what it's funded at currently. That venture started at 10K, which was, pathetic. I mean, come on, Craig. But I think it's quite a bit higher now.
You're talking about reading now, I'm talking about writing.
No, he's talking about synthesis.
Really?
Yeah.
Craig Venter?
As far as I know. Yeah.
Craig Venter?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think this is tied up with the X Prize Foundation. And of course, they have tied it, they're not thinking about space so much for that particular one, but they're looking at personal medicine. And so I would think that because they have so much interest in space and so much money from Google, that perhaps you could, induce them, because I don't know how far they've gotten with the personal medicine piece that Craig Venter was involved with, that maybe there could be some crossover.
Well, we're going to break the carbon barrier, I would guess, between 50 and 100 years. So I don't think we're going to colonize the solar system in the next 100 years. I could be wrong about that. The people here know a lot more about that than, in fact, I think everyone here probably knows a lot more about that.
Do you consider colonizing the moon, colonizing the solar system?
Well, colonizing the solar system is colonizing the solar system. Colonizing the moon would be colonizing one part of the solar system. So.
But would you say it meets your criteria though?
Well, I was addressing the question of, the priority of colonizing the solar system. I'm saying since we will break the carbon barrier long before we colonize the solar system, I think that point is mooted. But whether we'll break it before we colonize the moon, that's a good. You tell me. Are we going to colonize the moon in the next 50 to 100 years? Take a guess.
So there are a lot of people we haven't heard from. It would be great to have some wrap-up comments, and we need to wait till the next session to continue. Bob, what about you? Bob has a background from NASA Ames and Google and some personal stuff and a lot of writing, all sorts of writing. Yes? No. Anybody else? Sharon? Well, I don't want to call it.
I guess it's almost
Anybody?
10.
It's late.
Zann, for the point, I'm just curious a little bit, the relationship between the X prize and the prices that you have talked about. Is the X prize completely removed from a little bit the strategy you presented, or is there a tie as a model, perhaps, or as a way for them to know about this so they may help? Because X prize is becoming such a known entity out there that it may have the kind of critical mass that can definitely help.
Well, that's a possibility. I mean, X-Prize has a lot of money. I've been a little disappointed in what I've seen. For example, they had a representative at the Singularity Institute, where Steve presented last September. Their approach is very much, we get a pile of money, a few $100,000, and we run a workshop, and we bring in, all these big names, and it's not as bottom-up as it could be, I think. But anyway, the distinction is that the X Prize has a lot of money, and we're talking. We don't have enough.
I just would mention that I've begged Peter Diamandis for money on many occasions. Literally. So, I don't know how relevant that is.
Well, begging somebody for money, it's a
Well, I've
waste of
explained
time.
the concept to him as well, the begging came in.
Well, maybe the explanation wasn't that effective, I don't know. But the point being that whether it's a Branson or a Diamond is, those people are not dumb.
Well, the problem is that the A prize has, or at least I wouldn't say that I know, but my opinion is that the A prize has some very negative, connotations associated with it, that people who are potential funders of it don't, stops.
I don't think it's negative, it's non-qualified, it's not defined properly as the X prize is. The X prize is clear. You go up in the space, you pay so much and it's done.
Absolutely.
What's the A prize? For what are we trying to achieve with artificial light? Something that help us if we go in other environments, or something, a toy or a war game to play here on Earth?
I absolutely
We don't have that
agree.
answer yet.
It needs a better definition. And
Well,
I
that's
would welcome
definitely one topic of discussion, but the scientific approach we had tonight is clear that these are tools that we're going to need. We can play with them here on Earth now, but the point is that if we want to really inhabit Mars, we really got to use our brain before our muscles.
Well, once again, I
Right,
would
it's a
say that
muscle.
before we inhabit Mars, we're not going to be us anymore.
Hmm?
I said before we inhabit Mars, we are not going to be us anymore. And I think that that's something that's constantly.
We're not going to be existing anymore?
We're not going to be us anymore.
Biological
And I think that that's something that's constantly left.
Well, we have resisted only 4 million. What do you think we're going to change in 100 years now? 4 million years, we're pretty much in a similar shape. But less intelligent, actually, probably, than we used to be.
If you look at the curve, I don't know, Kate might be able to help me. 2 million years to the wheel, 5,000 years to DNA, 50 years to molecular biology, 5 years to whole genome sequencing. I don't know what mathematical function describes that curve, but things are moving very quickly.
You may see one of the following two phenomena, one of which is we haven't seen in Darwinian time anywhere, design a DNA and grow it. And the other thing we haven't seen in Darwinian evolution is substantially non-carbon things. So these can be examples of his kinds of successor non-human things.
But what you're talking about really is the best way to label it that I've come up with is molecular engineering. I mean, that's really what you're talking about, is a convergence of biological molecular engineering, which evolution learned how to do over 4 billion years, and non-biological molecular engineering, which we're learning how to do very quickly, which we call nanotechnology, although I think it's more accurate to call it molecular engineering.
And this could take a couple of different embodiments, one of which is to just use the conventional DNA mechanism but write the programs in it, and the other which is
That's
to go,
synthetic biology.
yeah, and the other, well, that could also get you a different species, or
Sure.
the other of which is to
They already
use
have.
alternative materials.
That is assuming that we were being designed, which is...
No, it's assuming that we
proven.
would be designers. It
Intelligent
doesn't assume how we came into existence, just that we would make some decisions about what to make next. Because of contrast to just sort of
We
letting
don't
it
know
go.
how we
Decisions
came
are
in
being
existence.
made
How can we
right
make a
now.
decision to move on?
That's an
Oh, they're
important
two
point
So-
for
different,
people.
they're
You
two
don't need to
different
reverse
worlds.
engineer yourself.
By the way, I want to throw out for the group, that if you Google iNanobot at salon.com, Allan Goldstein has written a powerful article, very well written, about the hazards and about the larger issues that he's been.
Well, that's where you'll find the definition of carbon barrier, that's where you'll find the animat test, you'll find all this stuff there.
What's the website again? What's the website again?
Yeah.
The website again?
Allan, ALAN, H Goldstein.com, or I.nanobot, playing with the
Nanobot,
robot,
yeah.
right? I.nano.
Yes, I shamelessly ripped that time off, hoping
One more
to generate
question
some
for
interest.
Boris. Over here.
I just have
Wrap it up.
a very practical question, and that is, I mean, there's certain things that are really that have been very interesting this year, and I don't think we had enough time to discuss them as I would have wanted to. So, is there a forum where I can continue this online sort of?
Yeah.
You guys haven't made
Be promoting for Tom Biota Live's live podcast conversations every Friday.
I was thinking more on online.
And there's a wiki on bio.org and there's financials, which you can post.
So we're going to put a page on my site where we design biomolecule materials. And once again, you'll find the definition of that iNanobot. And on that site, we're going to do everything basically transparently, and people are going to be asked to join in and help us design that switch. Because when we design that switch, we will work with the carbon barrier. So hopefully people will join in. I invite everyone to join in.
Okay, thank you all. If anyone want to say any comments?
Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming. Hope you come next month for our next meeting. Anyone wants to volunteer to talk in our next meeting? You can contact me also at my email.
Our next meeting will not be in August because you're traveling.
No, I'm not traveling. I'm staying here.
Okay.
I will be here. I hold it for this.
So probably later in August. We were already, Jeffrey's and Trella, we'll have to find out. He's actually flying to Vancouver sometime in August for 3 months. We'll have to pick it up on the list whether we go to the archive or not.
Okay, I appreciate it if you can just take some of the stuff that you want to throw up.
Thank you.
As a can.
Thank you.